Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 23rd of October 2024. This video has an awful lot of content. My goodness, there's a lot that's happened. And this is a 2-day geopolitics update for the world concerning the war in Ukraine. But actually, as we know, the global geopolitics is a spider web of interacting components, where you have, a fly landing over there, causing reverberations in the web, and that affects something over here and something over there. And we have this BRICS conference going on in Kazan in Russia that is going to have some impact on this 4D game of chess that the world is involved in, where Ukraine appears to be at the epicenter. So yeah, we'll start with BRICS then. So Russia advises BRICS summit participants to bring cash as Visa and MasterCard cards issued outside the country won't work due to sanctions, according to Bloomberg. Russia's Mir payment system has also faced restrictions, as even some of Moscow's closest allies have stopped using the card after it was hit by US sanctions. Not only that, there's some video footage of some of the metro stations being empty. People have been basically told to stay at home because they don't look. I think the idea is that some of them are quite poor. People's cars have been asked to be taken off the street because they look too crappy. Some of these old rusty larders are like, get that away. We want Kazan to look like amazing. We want Russia to. This is a PR exercise as much as anything, and we are showcasing Russia. And most of you guys suck, so stay away. So there's been these weird situations where people have been asked to just clear off and get out the way of the film crews and whatnot. Anyway, 16th BRICS summit has started. I think, although Anton Gerashenko says 33 countries expected, I think there's 36 there now. Kremlin propaganda has already called it the largest foreign policy event ever held in Russia. Representatives of 36 countries have confirmed their participation. 24 of them will be represented by first persons, 9 at the level of second and third persons. Kazan will also host 6 international organizations, said Shamil Gafarov, the deputy Prime Minister of Tatarstan. Among the participants are Indian Prime Minister Modi, Chinese President Xi Jinping, South African President Ramaphosa, heads of Egypt, Iran and UAE, Turkish President Erdogan and Belarus dictator Lukashenko have also confirmed participation. Now, we have a few people that aren't coming, so we'll come to that in a second. So it has started. Russians are expecting, in fact, it's pretty much done most of its stuff now. I think they've already had a declaration out there. The Russians are expecting representatives from all of those countries already mentioned. So this is interesting. 2024, BRICS has nearly doubled in size. The UAE, Egypt, Iran, and Ethiopia have joined. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So I presume that means that these 4 entrants are, and think about where they're from, that kind of Middle East, going over across into Eurasia, Persia kind of area, a hotbed of influence for Russia, it seems. And I guess we have to trust here what War Translated is saying, is that the official members of BRICS have somewhat doubled. Okay. And then, of course, when you're going to have a meeting with 36 countries, then the idea is for BRICS is that they want to expand that membership. Although it must be stated that the membership isn't quite as formal as one might think. So here we have, Jakub Janovsky from sort of Oryx saying, FYI, BRICS is not an alliance. Apparently very few people who write about it even bother to read any relevant documents. It is pretty much a discussion club like the G7, and some of the BRICS members are openly hostile to each other. It is definitely a marriage of convenience for some people, and it's not that that these nations are joined by any kind of ideology other than, I think, the ideology that we don't want the US to be at the top of the global hegemony. We want to create some kind of alternative to that. This multipolar world. And in one sense, you can understand that, because obviously if all the powers concentrated in one entity, then that entity gets to dictate everything, and it almost starts looking like a global dictatorship, if you see what I mean. So there are good arguments for a multipolar world. The only problem is that those trying to provide or present an alternative to the US global hegemony are really bad faith actors. So when you're talking about not so much Brazil has a chance to be a really positive, member of any organization. What we've got Russia, we've got China, We've got South Africa, I think, is being a little bit weak at the moment and following along with those others, but it's certainly the weaker member of BRICS in its original formation. India is an interesting one. So you've got Modi, who is a nationalist leader and rather like China, is not interested in ideology, but is very interested in its own people for, again, for, justifiable reasons. So marriages of convenience are kind of par for the course, because actually we want a relationship with you guys whereby it's to the advantage of my people. So China want to feed their people. India want to feed that. You've got 1 billion members of your nation, and you need to look after them. That's your kind of first job. And so whenever you are looking to how you do things, how you either support or don't Russia, say Russia with the Ukraine war, China are always going to be thinking in terms of, okay, how does this benefit us? It's not like helping Russia because we're ideologically linked and actually this is kind of communism against capitalism, or this is not that that's at all accurate with either of those countries. This is kind of, and even anti-American imperialism as it might be interpreted by those nations, it's going to be more transactional. It's like, yeah, we're going to help you because actually it benefits us in this particular context and that particular context, and we're looking at taking on Taiwan, so our support for you is more about whether we can slip the Taiwan thing under the radar, etc., etc. And I think that's generally the commonality with many people who are in BRICS. It's not they're joined by ideology, but as nations, they aren't exactly the sort of people we look towards to say, yeah, actually they'd do a better job than the US at ruling the world, if you like, at being at the top of the hegemonic ladder. It's like, Iran, nah. UAE, not really. Egypt, not so much. Ethiopia, meh. And so you look at the list of countries, and no disrespect to some of these countries, I guess, but actually, I don't massively respect really many of these countries. I think the one that sticks out for me there is Brazil with its potential. It is a democracy. It's a massive country. It's got a huge economy, and we've seen governments of opposite ends of the spectrum there in ways that we probably haven't seen in other countries that they're all sort of at one end of the spectrum and stuck there. I think, you've got Russia is a dictatorship. China is essentially a dictatorship. UAE, functionally the same. Iran, functionally the same. So on and so forth. So anyway, these guys are all meeting. Now, the massive controversy that's taken place from the Ukrainian point of view is the UN Secretary General, that's Guterres. I keep saying Gutierrez as if he's Spanish. Of course, as pointed out, he's Portuguese, so it's Guterres. I presume that's how you pronounce it. So the UN Secretary General has declined Ukraine's invitation to go to the first Global Peace Summit in Switzerland. So he said, I'm not going to go to that. But he did, however, accept the invitation to go to Kazan to meet with the war criminal Putin. This is a wrong choice, and this does not advance the cause of peace. It only damages the UN's reputation. Now, that is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine saying that. So this is an official statement for Ukraine. This isn't some rando on Twitter. This is the MFA of Ukraine saying, what are you doing? It's a wrong choice. You didn't accept coming here. You have gone there. This is a wrong choice, and it damages the reputation of the UN. And lots of people are in general agreement with this. As here Max24 says, this is a standard and normal practice. That's what UN Secretary General has stated on his visit to BRICS to meet all those leaders. It's like standard practice. Yeah, but you didn't go to the Global Peace Summit, so why is that? And as Elon said, it's really impermissible that the UN Secretary General visits a person declared wanted by the International Criminal Court, a UN institution. The West should, 1, declare Guterres persona non grata, 2, refuse to attend any meeting with him, and 3, oust him from the UN. So what I'm saying is this is causing really quite a lot of consternation. Now, here Euromaidan Press says, quote, a historic low. Spravd says, Stratcom Centre says, in what must be the historical low for the United Nations, UN Secretary General in Kazan allowing himself to be used as a prop to legitimise an internationally wanted war criminal and his genocidal regime while Ukrainians are being massacred. Now, the issue here, if I'm trying to be as objective as possible, Guterres, yeah, he will have his own personal worldview and politics, right? But we can very easily confuse the UN with being something that represents only or should represent Western views. And but then it has its own charter, which is its moral framework. And the question is, is going to Kazan and meeting with Putin, is that part of the UN charter? When Russia has invaded a sovereign nation and has committed X number of war crimes, and when the International Criminal Court has put an arrest warrant out for Putin, is it right that you, on behalf of the UN, are going around eating cakes made of stolen Ukrainian grain? So on the one hand, we shouldn't confuse the UN with being an arm of the West. Like, the UN represents all the nations of the world, and we shouldn't expect that all the nations of the world should be doing or wanting to do exactly what we in the West, or me as a European British person who is pro NATO, pro EU, pro US, broadly speaking. Like, not all the world is. And so when the United Nations do things, they have to think, well, we're kind of above this party political, if you like, global fight. But if you are going to have the UN Charter of Human Rights and your UN Charter in general, how does that play? Are you adhering to your own moral framework? So, Secretary General of the United Nations has decided not to come to Ukrainian peace summit, says Anton Gerashchenko, but has accepted the invitation of war criminal Putin instead. And this doesn't help. So when you are dressing up and you are doing all of these kind of photo shoots that are really playing into Russian propaganda hands, like, this is ill-advised. Even if I'm being as charitable to Guterres as I can possibly be, I just think this is ill-advised. Really, really controversial. And I think, he's got an interesting position with regard to Israel-Palestine, and that's got him in a bit of hot water with certain people and certain demographics. And he's all over the shop, really. Well, maybe he's not all over the shop. Maybe actually his own personal ideology is very much coming through here. Now, Armenia follows Kazakhstan in declaring no plans to join BRICS. So that's 40% of the Eurasian Economic Union. So that's good news. It's not all good news for the Russians here. Presidents of Cuba, Serbia and Brazil have not attended the BRICS summit. So the Cuban president is dealing with energy problems in the country. Cuba is going through a bit of a crisis at the moment where it's all falling to bits and they're having blackouts and there's energy issues. Serbian president had a long-planned event on his schedule. And I don't know what that says, whether it's a genuine excuse or what. And the Brazilian president was injured in a bathtub fall. Now, some people on my threads have been saying, Lula's not going because he's had a heart attack. He's had a stroke, sorry. And that's a genuine reason. And because I put my speculation out yesterday that Lula's an interesting one in terms of not liking the US, but also not liking Russia. And so I think not going to BRICS fits quite in line with Lula, with my view of probably who Lula is. But he either may have had a stroke and it's being sold as falling in the bathtub, or he has fallen in the bathtub and genuinely is not well enough to fly. Last week, Friday, an accident at a thermal power plant in Cuba caused a complete power outage. About 10 million people left without light. Over the weekend, 4 attempts were made to restore the power supply, but no success so far. The situation is aggravated by the fact that Hurricane Oscar has approached Cuba. So that's what's going on in Cuba. Now, with regard to Brazil, the Independent here says President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil, one of the founding members of BRICS, cancelled his trip to Russia, citing an emergency medical issue. Mr. Lula's doctor, Robert Khalil, said in an interview with the Globo News TV channel that the president suffered a fall that caused, quote, great trauma to the back of his head, requiring stitches and resulting in a, quote, small brain hemorrhage, which can just be, well, bleeding on the brain. That's mentioning the brain. So the official line is pretty serious, right? Or potentially serious. He will participate in a BRICS meeting via video conference, his office said. Mr. Lula is scheduled to host the next G20 leaders summit later this year, one of which Mr. Putin is likely to skip in light of the ICC arrest warrant against him and Brazil being a signatory to the Rome Statute. So this is a view that I generally agree with here. So this is from Marcus Leboschka on my thread. who says, my feeling about Lula of Brazil is, President of Brazil, is he despises the US, which is not surprising, looking at his own history. In the 1970s and 1980s, he was arrested and tortured by the dictatorship running Brazil that was supported by the US. But he might have figured out by now that Putin's Russia is more of the same and even worse. To me, it looks like he tries to do his own thing now, which is the best path for Brazil and him. I kind of agree with this. So that's why I speculated. It was just my speculation that he probably didn't fall or didn't have a stroke. But, you know, as Patrick Carlson here says, the reason Lula's not coming to the BRICS meeting is that he got a stroke. Now, that's not official. That's not written anywhere officially. And he did not want to go, which would be the better reason. If that's true, then, of course, that is a better reason. But, you know, one would need to provide solid evidence for that. I just think that it was easier for Lula that he doesn't go, and I think he is kind of doing his own thing to some degree there, whilst also taking money from kind of fertilizer imports and exports and whatnot. There is this very close relationship, economic relationship between, in terms of the need for natural resources, between Russia and Brazil. Now, the UAE president, United Arab Emirates president, has met with Putin and expressed his commitment to supporting peace efforts between Russia and Ukraine. UAE has been quite important in the swapping of prisoners. They've been integral in these exchanges. So, although the UAE is a place where lots of exports end up, you know, finding a home for a short while before going to Eurasia and Russia. Ultimately Russia. So UAE is definitely, I think, on the side of Russia, but they are also involved in prison exchanges. So after the meeting, the UAE president said he emphasized the UAE's role in mediating prisoner exchanges and its dedication to working toward resolving crises for the benefit of both sides. Interesting that Julian Assange, so your WikiLeaks guy, his dad is in Moscow for the BRICS summit and thanked Putin for supporting his son. If you want to know which side of the coin, you know, which side of who is buttering Julian Assange's bread, you know, Russia. Russia were the ones that were trying to promote all the Julian Assange leaks that were really hurting Hillary Clinton. And this is part of that 2016 interference project of the Russians on the US elections. And if you don't believe that, then just have a look at the behaviour of Julian Assange's dad, who's going to BRICS and formally thanking Putin for supporting his son. I mean, there you go. Yeah. The deputy head of the Hamas Politburo has arrived on a visit to Russia. Representative of the terrorist organisation Musa Abu Marzouk intends to hold a number of meetings with Russian officials in Moscow. This is reported by the Kremlin media. This is who they hang out with these days, Hamas. Earlier on October the 22nd, the head of the Palestinian National Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, flew to Kazan for the BRICS summit. So Palestinians involved in the BRICS summit and Hamas. One must be very careful to differentiate Hamas from Palestine. They are two different entities, or broadly speaking, all Hamas are Palestinians, but not all Palestinians are Hamas. Same logic as all dogs are animals, but not all animals are dogs. So it's very easy to conflate Hamas and Palestine, and that would be incorrect. And that is what underwrites much of the mischaracterization of what's going on between Israel and Palestine and in Gaza. So you've got, you know, Israel laying absolute mayhem, laying down all these bombs in Gaza, destroying lots of civilian infrastructure that's Palestinian, and many people saying, oh, that's all right because they're trying to get Hamas, or they're all Hamas, and therefore that's justified. And other people going, hang on, those are children, women, children, and, you know, just general civilians. And then other people saying, yeah, but the Hamas are hiding behind them. And then other people saying, well, does that justify bombing civilians just because bad people are hiding behind them, etc., etc. And you get all these arguments raging. But we must always differentiate Palestinians from Hamas. And of course, more Palestinians will join Hamas, the more that Israel will kill Palestinians in general. And so this is a very difficult situation. I don't want to be attacked for like taking one side or another here. It is a super difficult situation. But you've got your Palestinian National Authority, which is not the PLO, interestingly, who have become the more formal kind of Palestinian authority. So yeah, I think that's differentiated from the PNA here. But anyway, you got the Palestinians going to Kazan, and you've got Hamas going to Moscow. Now, you know, if you're mates with Iran and Hamas and North Korea, you've got to ask yourself whether you are doing the right things here. Now, the German tabloid newspaper reports that Erdogan, the Turkish leader, is seeking to join Putin's BRICS alliance, despite Turkey being a member of NATO. So this is where it gets really difficult, complicated, this tangled web of international geopolitics, where you're kind of like, what's going on here? Are you not with NATO? I mean, how can you have a NATO member state whose kind of set goals are to effectively combat the Soviet Union qua Russian Federation, going to join a union with the Russian Federation? What's happening there? What does that mean about the sharing of intelligence? What does that mean about the sharing of technology, of the knowledge of NATO weaponry? The US is in the middle of selling a whole bunch of airframes to Turkey. What are you doing going and cozying up to Russia? So according to Russian media reports, Turkey's application for membership may be considered these days in Kazan, according to Turkish foreign policy expert Azli Aydintaşbaş. Quote, this would cause enormous damage to Turkey's relations with NATO. But Erdogan feels that the West is avoiding him, so he wants to make it jealous. You've got these moves, counter moves, this is just the intrigue of international geopolitics, right? BRICS countries have approved the Kazan declaration of the BRICS summit. It is planned to disseminate it to the UN, according to Putin. Other statements are, the dollar is being used as a weapon. This is a big mistake. Putin said that the Russian Federation is not fighting the dollar, but is looking for alternatives. And broadly speaking, it's one of the main raisons d'etre for the existence of BRICS. He called for the BRICS summit participants in Kazan, the world's majority countries. And of course, I warn about BRICS, not what it is now, but where it might be in 50 years' time if we don't think about how to work against it or with it or however. There is this growing phenomenon that is BRICS. Don't laugh it off now because it's not what many claim it is right now or want it to be right now. It's where it is going. Now, on to other geopolitical topics. Zelensky has urged allies to increase pressure on North Korea. So 2 North Korean brigades of up to 6,000 personnel each are currently undergoing training in Russia. Zelensky said, we expect a firm, concrete response from the world. I've talked about how the world is underplaying their response in order not to do exactly what Russia and North Korea probably want us to do, which is panic, go, and then, and then escalate and then cause X, Y, and Z. But on the other hand, there appears to be clear, well, in this case, rhetoric from Mark Rutte from NATO, the Secretary General, concerning escalation. So sending North Korean troops to Ukraine will lead to escalation, says Nexter. If North Korea sends its troops to Ukraine to fight on the side of Russia, it will significantly escalate the conflict, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said. So basically, to say it will clearly escalate the conflict means that, well, now that we know that North Koreans are there pretty much, the Pentagon's now admitted it today. So if you're saying, if you're going to help, if North Korea is going to help Russia, that will clearly escalate the conflict. Oh, you have helped Russia, so now you have to escalate it. So this is an acceptance, almost like explicit communication that NATO will escalate. Unless this is a misinterpretation from Nexter. South Korean foreign ministry summons the Russian ambassador demanding the withdrawal of North Korean soldiers from Russia, according to Yonhap. In response, Russian ambassador Zinoviev has said that cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang is in line with international law and is not directed against South Korea's security interests. France will fulfill... So moving aside from North Korea, we're going to now talk about, say, Russia moving on to Poland and the Baltics after Ukraine. If it prevailed in the war against Ukraine. So France will fulfill its obligations if the Baltic states are attacked by Russia, according to the Minister of Armed Forces. He's announced this on LCI News, on news channel. So that's Sébastien Lecornu saying, I did not expect, says French aid to Ukraine, Lecornu's statement to hurt some people's egos, that they want him to say the opposite. France will fulfill its obligations if the Baltic states are attacked. So I think this is interesting. France is being very, very rhetorically strong there, although, you know, there will be obligations anyway with NATO Article 5. That's precisely why the Baltics haven't been invaded, and Ukraine has. This idea of like NATO expansionism being a cause for this war. I would say NATO expansionism not having happened with Ukraine is a cause for this war. Like the fact that they're not in NATO is itself what has helped facilitate this war. So Russians are no longer hiding their intent to take the Balkans. So we look at France's declaration in the context of what is being said on state television. Russian propagandists are saying, quote, a settlement in Ukraine will not solve anything at all. If we talk about the long-term perspective, then Russia's security is about returning to the Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe. So Russia's security is about returning to the Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe. Wow. They are unashamed in their declaration of megalomaniacal imperialist intentions. It's incredible. Like, if you want to know what the Kremlin thinks, just go and watch state TV. They'll tell you. Right, Russian spies were watching Georgia's government and major companies in a comprehensive espionage and hacking campaign over years, according to Bloomberg. It gave Moscow the capability to tamper with Georgia's vital infrastructure services, should it have chosen to, including power and communications networks, if the government in Tbilisi drifted in directions that were unwelcome, says the Ukrainian Review. GRU hacked Georgia's Central Election Commission, likely gaining access to some email accounts and several media organizations. It also gained access to multiple IT systems at Georgia's National Railway Company for more than 2 years. So Russia is heavily involved in espionage within Georgia, heavily involved in influence operations in Georgia. They pretty much control the Georgia Dream governing ruling party. And Ivanishvili, the kind of billionaire chappie who's behind Georgian Dream, is in the pocket of the Kremlin himself. Now, there was a huge sort of peaceful protest in Tbilisi, in Tbilisi over the weekend, and the Georgian capital saw just vast crowds with EU flags, being very pro-EU, protesting against the direction that Georgian Dream is taking the country in. Now, Jay and Kiev post this video, fascinating. So like we saw in Ukraine in 2013, pro-Russian Titushki were sent in to beat protesters last night in Tbilisi, but locals tracked them down at a restaurant before they can make it to the show. They didn't like being exposed. And we saw these guys beating up on protesters the last time that they were protesting against the foreign agents law that was enacted by Georgian Dream. Eventually, it was vetoed by the president, then it was pushed through parliament, and it eventually got through. And that was the pro-Russian law, or the kind of Russian-inspired law that led to these protests that were then heavily clamped down upon by not just the Georgian police and riot police, etc., but actually these people called Titushki, who are thugs employed by Russia to go and do things on behalf of, in this case, Russia, or on behalf of the Georgian Dream. But these are kind of like, oh, who are you? And in fact, we heard Russian being stated by some of the, I think it was actually one of the riot police members, so in Georgia, so speaking Russian, you're like, what's going on there? There seem to be Russians all over the place doing the bidding of, or not doing the bidding of Georgian Dream, enforcing that Georgian Dream do the bidding of Russia. And these guys were then called in again and you had Titushki in the Euromaidan protest. Go and watch Winter on Fire, which is free on YouTube, I think, now, but it's on Netflix. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen in my life. It's incredibly powerful. But you'll see that these people were very active in the Euromaidan protests as well. Now, Georgia, you know that Russia are gearing up to interfere with the elections. You know that Georgia Dream are going to be trying to make sure that the elections are not free and are not fair. Here's a good Indicator, Georgia denies a journalist entry to cover the elections amid rising Russian influence. Czech-British journalist Reade Baisley was denied entry to Georgia without an explanation after arriving in Tbilisi airport yesterday to cover the upcoming elections. Wow. So, unsurprisingly, no, really. He's currently being held at the airport and should be sent back in 2 days, his partner told the Kyiv Independent. Georgia are on a knife edge here, and my goodness, I hope that they are able to exercise their democratic desires as peacefully and as fairly as possible. As we've just seen in Moldova, there have been these elections and an EU referendum that narrowly scraped by pro EU, but there are many claims of Russian influence, and some of it appears to be fairly verifiable. Here is someone that is interviewed by a BBC journalist who was waiting to get paid by a Russian for voting in a certain way during the elections. I don't know whether that's the EU election, referendum, or the presidential election, but it certainly was at least the EU elections. Waiting to get paid some moolah for doing that. I heard on my threads over the last few videos, people who are connected with Moldova saying, yeah, I know. Someone saying my wife is Moldovan and she knows people who were paid to, X, Y, and Z. And we're taking photos of their ballots in order to take back the evidence that they voted. So apparently what you had to do is go and vote, take a photo of your voting sheet, and then that's your evidence that you voted in favour of the Russians, and then the Russians would pay you, blah, blah, blah. This happened, but luckily the Russians didn't win out here, and EU accession scraped by 51% in the end. Now, Moldova's referendum on joining the EU, which took place alongside elections in the country, occurred under, quote, unprecedented interference by Russia and its proxies, according to European Commission spokesperson Peter Stano. Absolutely true, and I think the evidence is very clearly out there. We've seen a number of pieces of video evidence like this with testimony and various bits and pieces to suggest that there was huge amounts of interference. In fact, it's thought that there was millions and millions of dollars was plied into disinformation campaigns in Moldova, Transnistria, Gagauzia. Now, if you're thinking about Georgia or Moldova, here we have something from Adrian P., which is a Romanian here, one presumes. He says in the 17 years, and it's very easy to be a bit critical of Romania if you are coming from a privileged kind of UK position, where we were in the Brexit elections, we were like, oh, we don't want Eastern Europe to join the EU. We're going to get loads of Romanians over here, Polish, Turkish people. Turkey, my dad was saying, like, we're going to have 80 million Turks no, we're not, in the UK within, and actually this is what Boris Johnson said, and it was just simply untrue. Turkey were never going to get into the EU because they wouldn't have even qualified on the freedom of press. There's loads of issues with Turkey that they simply couldn't have joined the EU, particularly by 2016, 2024, and they're even further away now, right? So these scaremongering stories about X and Y and Z joining the EU are problematic, but when countries do join the EU, it's about, hopefully, the idea is it's not this zero-sum game of we're going to go down as you come in and go up, but it's, look, we can all improve, and you can pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. So actually, we all have a framework to lift you up so that Europe is just a better, stronger place as we work together, and there are more member states who are doing better. It's just better for the world. So Adrian P. here says, fact, in the 17 years Romania has been in the European Union, quality of life has increased tenfold. Poverty has been significantly reduced. GDP has grown year by year. Social mobility and education is way more accessible. Infrastructure has been built, and we could have done even more if not for the commie dingleberries left in our politics. And Romania is more secure and stronger as a country than it ever was in its entire history. I mean, goodness, you almost had a Romanian, Iohannis, the Prime Minister of Romania, President of Romania, but he was touted as being one of the options for the Secretary General of NATO. So Mark Rutte, Kaja Kallas from Estonia, and actually Iohannis from Romania. So Romania and they're super important for NATO. They're right on the eastern edge of NATO and provide, ample a strategic benefit for NATO in terms of bases, air bases particularly, and whatnot. So, Romania are important, but also they've really benefited from being a part of the EU, and that's why Russia is fighting so hard to discredit and disband the EU, says Adrian P. A united and strong Europe means doom for Russia, and this is the worry that Russia has with regard to somewhere like Moldova or Georgia. Is you start doing better, and this is a problem with the Ukraine, not the problem with. This is the worry of Ukraine. Ukraine is on the doorstep of Russia. It is over the fence, and if the Russians are peeking over the fence and seeing how well Ukraine is doing, and as Ukraine has done better and better in the last 15 years, right, democracy. So Ukraine have done a much better job of integrating democracy into the nation, right? So Ukraine has, at the same time as Russia, the dissolution of the USSR, Russia and Ukraine could have had very similar paths, but actually Russia went the oligarch path and failed democracy and then re-embraced dictatorship through Putin. And Ukraine, even though there are still issues and corruption and oligarchs and whatnot, they still have large elements of that left over from the Soviet era. They're fighting really hard against that, and they've taken this option to go towards Europe. Euromaidan protests will tell you that, etc., etc. And the youth, and it's this young and vibrant country, it feels, that is trying very hard to reform itself and is going in this other direction. And the problem for Russia is, as the people peek over the fence from Russia to look into the garden of Ukraine, they get a little bit jealous. The grass really is a little bit greener over that side. And then that leads to domestic discontent with your population in Russia. That's why Russia don't want fully functioning democratic nations on their border, because it will lead to envy. And envy leads to discontent, and discontent leads to a toppling of government. So it's in the Kremlin's best interest from a national security or from a political security point of view to stifle the democratic successes of neighbouring countries, which is why you try and keep Azerbaijan and Armenia, all these countries in these CSTO and BRICS style stuff and whatever, Shanghai Cooperation Agreements and organisations, blah, blah, blah. You try and keep a tight lid on these guys doing better and better on their own. But Ukraine managed to break away from that, and that has really, really peed Putin off, and he's worried how it might affect his own population. Now, Orbán, good old Viktor Orbán, the dictator wannabe in charge of Hungary, is featuring again in some EU speeches. Let's play this from Damien Böselager, who's an MEP, member of European Parliament, and co-founder of Volt Europa, Future of Europe and EU Reform. Okay, so he says about Viktor Orbán.
Russia needs to pay. Russia needs to pay for the reconstruction. Russia needs to pay for bombing children and hospitals and electricity plants. And I'm happy we're making the invader pay, because for some it's still hard to understand, but Russia is the invader. But colleagues, it's also part of the truth that Orbán is again stopping a more long-term solution within the Ukraine facility that we just approved a couple of months ago, and that he's stopping 10 billion euros from the US by not allowing the extension of the freezing of the Russian assets. So for all those who have been clapping here last week, 2 weeks ago, for Orbán, who is sitting here from the far left and the far right, we have to be aware that you're on the side of North Korea now, that is trying to help Russia invade. You're on the side of Putin, you're on the side of the guy who is using Russian interests within the European Council, and we need to wake up, we need to make Russia pay and Ukraine win. Thank you.
This is incredibly powerful, and this argument should be repeated an awful lot, and I think it should be repeated in the US. Like, Russia has now invited North Korea to help it in its war with Ukraine. If you are someone like Orbán or even Trump and JD Vance, who appears to be in some way supportive of what Russia is doing, or at least not supportive of what Ukraine is trying to do in defend its sovereign territory, you are by extension supportive of North Korea, which is one of the world's worst dictatorships. If you can't clearly say North Korea is bad, we don't want to be like North Korea, there's something wrong with you politically speaking. Right? So, if Russia's best mates are North Korea and Iran, you throw Iran in on that. And if you're really worried about China, throw China in on that. if that's who you're supporting, mate, you're in the wrong country. So if you're a US citizen, I would suggest just, getting on your bike and cycling over to China or Russia or, I don't know, North Korea. See how you get on there. So if you are clapping, someone who's been clapping Orbán in the European Parliament because you're on the far left or far right, as your man here says, yeah, oh, well done, Orbán, well done for standing up to the evil EU and standing up against aid to Ukraine. You are clapping North Korea. If you're clapping Orbán, Orbán is in support of Russia and Russia is in support of North Korea. You are supporting North Korea by clapping Orbán. So if you're a US conservative, a Republican conservative of the MAGA ilk who thinks Viktor Orbán's amazing, by the way, by extension, you're supportive of North Korea. Just come out and say it. I'd like you to admit it. And if you don't admit it, you need to change your approach to international politics and the support of Ukraine. And I think that angle is should be fruitful. Now, what's really good news with regard to Hungary is for the first time since 2010, Hungary's opposition party has overtaken Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's Fidesz party. So this is a guy, is it Peter Magyar, who I think essentially, if you translate his name, means Hungary, Peter Hungary. So it's a pretty apt surname. But he is this dissident, really, from Fidesz, who was married to someone who was also a Fidesz politician. He had a recording of his former wife and I think Orbán in that conversation. Anyway, it implicated them all for corruption. And that caused loads of controversy. And anyway, his new party seemed to have grown. It did really well in the European elections and actually caused the Fidesz party to have its lowest success in the European elections, basically ever. And now, a latest survey from Budapest 21 Research Centre shows 42% support for the Tisza party, so that is Magyar's party, and Fidesz only on 40%. So now we have the opposition party overtaking them. The challenge for the opposition party is, it's probably going to be, as far as I understand it, it's a bit of a conglomeration of all sorts of different people who are against Fidesz. A lot of them will be Fidesz people who have come over, like the leader himself. The question is, how do you coalesce? What identity are you? What's your ideology? You can't just be opposition. You need to be standing for something. What differentiates you from Fidesz? If you're going to go too far in the other direction, ideologically speaking, then you're going to lose those disaffected Fidesz people. It's rather like American politics. The more you go to the left, you're going to lose the voters who are disaffected with Trump from the Republican Party, who you were otherwise going to attract. So you go to the centre, blah blah blah. So how does Tisza negotiate their future? What will their identity be in Hungarian politics? And I think that's still to be established. But really, really good news here. Among the entire population, however, Fidesz still leads 29% to Tisza's 26%. So this is, not remember because I haven't said it yet. So this is the Budapest. So you are going to have often more support for liberal ideals and possibly just general opposition to ruling governments within large, oftentimes urban elite areas. It's the same in Russia. So, the places that have the greatest opposition to Putin are Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? Your kind of richer, more educated elites, they are more likely to go liberal, to skew liberal and be anti-authoritarian. So that's going to be the case with Budapest, and it's how Tisza do out in more rural communities or like the smaller towns and industrial areas. But to be only 26% behind 29%, I think is still really heartening there. So that's good news. China has become the main buyer of Russian gas over the past 9 months. According to Bloomberg, Gazprom exported 23.7 billion cubic meters of natural gas to China in January to September, almost 40% more than in the same period in 2023. According to Bloomberg calculations based on Chinese customs information and data from Russia's economy ministry. China surpassed Europe in this indicator, say Nexter. According to Bloomberg, calculations from January to September, Gazprom delivered 22.5 billion cubic meters of gas to European customers via Ukraine and the Turkish Stream pipeline. In July, Bloomberg reported that Europe and China are alternately becoming the largest buyers of Russian gas and competing as a main sales market for Gazprom. Now, Poland wants to see the secret annexes in the Ukraine's victory plan. Remember, there are 5 public points to the victory plan and 3 secret annexes that are only being shown, I think, to certain people. Polish foreign minister said, we want to see this. He added that Poland had helped Ukraine in a special way because, quote, when Germany was talking about sending helmets, Poland provided 320 tanks. I think he's got a point there. If anyone should get to see what... If you're going to support Ukraine, as much as Poland have supported Ukraine, then it's probably right that you should get to see those secret annexes. If other countries do, you know. So if Germany get to see that, why don't Poland? And I do get that. Poland has shut down a Russian consulate in Poznan amid claims of sabotage. Poland is closing down that consulate due to sabotage attempts from Russia, according to the Foreign Minister Radoslav Sikorski yesterday. A number of suspected spy networks allegedly run by Minsk, so it's Belarus, and Moscow have been uncovered in Poland over the past few years. Okay, now we're going to go on, and I told you there's an awful lot. It's jam-packed full of stuff, and my goodness, it's already been 45 minutes. How do I do this quickly? Right, because this is US politics with regard to Ukraine and Russia. Right, Biden warns of devastating consequences for Russia if Navalny dies in prison. Navalny died in prison. What were the devastating consequences? So there's often this, big bombastic language from Biden that isn't it doesn't get followed up. Some people are saying, and I'm going to play you one minute of Biden back in whenever this was, 90s, 80s. If we had this Biden, Putin would be gone. This is fascinating. I'm just going to play you just over a minute of what he says. But this is Joe Biden when he was a bit of a firebrand, and my goodness, it's impressive.
What is our interest? What is our interest? Our interest is that history repeated itself. And let me be presumptuous enough to go on a little more what I think the next history lesson will be. The Soviet Empire has collapsed. The good news. The bad news is all the ethnic hatreds, all the ethnic fighting, all the atrocities that occurred 100 years ago and 40 years ago are now uncovered again. There are 25 million Russians living outside the border of Russia, in Ukraine, in the Balkans, in Kazakhstan. There is war in Armenia, Georgia, and almost all of it is based on ethnicity.
1995.
And what is the message we send to the world if we stand by and we say, we'll let it continue to happen here in this place, but it is not in our interest. We don't fear that it will spread. I'm not here to tell you if we don't act, it will spread tomorrow and cause a war in Europe or next year, but I'm here to tell you within the decade it will cause a spread of war and a cancer and the collapse of the Western Alliance. And what's so important about the Western Alliance? NATO for NATO's sake, so we can beat our breast? What I'm about to say is going to cause me great difficulty if I'm reelected and come back here as the ranking member or chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. But Europe cannot stay united without the United States. There is no moral center in Europe. When in the last 2 centuries had the French or the British or the Germans or the Belgians or the Italians moved in a way to unify that continent, to stand up to this kind of genocide?
And so on and so forth. And of course, that is prior to the EU becoming the organisation it is today. So bear in mind that is 30 years ago now. This was when the US sent troops to Bosnia, and you had a very strong foreign policy sentiment there from Joe Biden, saying, look, if we don't act now, this cancer will grow and there will be war in Europe. Now, that speech could be applied right now to Ukraine. He could be making that speech with that fire in his belly right now, except he's too old to do that. But my goodness, that's a Joe Biden that we miss, right? And that's the kind of speech we're missing on the floor of the Senate. Like, just all we hear is like Russian appeasement, and then a bit of a damp squib in trying to beat that down, because Republicans don't have the guts to say things like that out loud and public and forcefully like that, because it goes against the grain of what the top of the party are espousing. And then hearing that kind of stuff right now in this election period will make Ukraine seem too partisan, but really impressive to see that. Now, what I keep saying this, but I think history will show that one of the most important things the US has been doing in this war has been the economic war. So we talk about conventional war, information war, cyber war, economic war. And we are involved in this economic war with Russia, and it's the Treasury Department that is doing a heck of a lot of work. And maybe Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary might get some plaudits in retrospect. Next week, the US will tighten anti-Russian sanctions, according to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. The new measures will target intermediaries in third countries supplying critical military components to Russia. It's so super important. This stops Russia being able to fund the war as effectively as they have been, or as effectively as they would like. US is to continue to tighten the screws on Russian LNG exports, according to the senior official. That's really important. So one of the things is going to be the shipping of liquefied natural gas out of Russia to other places. And of course, that's to the best interest of the US, that has a very active export industry for LNG itself. Bank account used for Trump's hush money payments got cash linked to a Russian oligarch, says Raw Story. So bank account used for Trump's hush money payments got cash linked to Russian oligarch Andrew Weissman here. So the latest bombshell book on the Trump administration reveals new details on the special counsel investigation into the president's relationship with Moscow. Quote, the team led by Robert Mueller, the special counsel, failed to do everything it could to determine what happened in the 2016 election, shying away from steps like subpoenaing President Trump and scrutinizing his finances out of the fear he would fire them. One of Mr. Mueller's top lieutenants argued in the first insider account of the inquiry, the New York Times reported on Monday. Quote, the team took elaborate steps to protect its files of evidence from the risk that the Justice Department might destroy them if Mr. Trump fired them, and worked to keep reporters and the public from learning what they were up to, Mr. Weissman wrote in Where Law Ends Inside the Mueller Investigation, which Random House will publish next week. The newspaper reported, while he speaks reverently of Mr. Mueller, he also says his boss's diffidence made him ill-suited for acts of shepherding the politically charged investigation. He saw Mr. Mueller as his deputy, Aaron Zebley, as overly cautious. According to the Times, the book contains bombshell new revelations. Quote, and he revealed new details, for example, writing that the same business account that sent hush payments to an adult film star who alleged an extramarital affair with Mr. Trump had also received payments linked to a Russian oligarch. The president has denied the affair. His former lawyer, Michael Cohen, controlled the account. Mr. Mueller transferred the Cohen matter to prosecutors in New York, and Mr. Weissman provided no further details about the Russian payments, the newspaper reported. Ty Cobb, a lawyer for Mr. Trump, also privately promised to be a canary in a coal mine and provide a heads up if Mr. Trump was going to fire the special counsel team, according to Mr. Weissman. Mr. Cobb did not respond for a request for comment, etc., etc. So, yeah, more and more links politically between Russia and the US here. And another link here. So remember the baseless conspiracy theory being pushed on here last week, says David Gilbert, about Tim Walz abusing a former student. Turns out it came from Russia. So Kyiv Independent reports Russia-linked disinformation campaign spreads false claims about the Tim Walz, US intelligence officials say. Russian disinformation groups have been linked to viral attacks targeting Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Walz, US intelligence sources said yesterday. An analyst connected the disinformation to Russian operations aimed at undermining the Democratic ticket of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So this is, typical, completely unsurprising, but really worrying. Walz has served as governor in Minnesota since 2019 after spending 12 years in Congress. He is an Army veteran, having enlisted in the National Guard as a teenager and serving for another 24 years. Walz was also a high school teacher before entering politics. The false content was spread, which includes baseless claims about Walz's past as a teacher, was found to have several signs of manipulation. Analysts connected the disinformation to Russian operations aimed at undermining the Democratic ticket. Private researchers has already flagged these videos as fake, with one particularly false claim involving a man impersonating a former student of Walz's to accuse him of misconduct. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Walz has been a vocal advocate for Ukraine in its fight against Russia, signing legislation barring state agencies from doing business with Russian and Belarusian companies, so on and so forth. So Walz is a real big supporter of Ukraine, and there's lots of disinformation being spread, and the source, of course, is Russia. Now, CBS has done a news analysis revealing that the clear majority of tweets by Elon Musk about the 2024 presidential election are either misinformation or disinformation. Clear majority. This is a fascinating article, by the way, that I've read myself. I talked about it on Facebook. I'm using that blocker there. I better turn that off. So this is really, really worth looking at, I would say. So let's just do that again. We'll just look at a couple of paragraphs that I think are interesting to note. So here we go. CBS News collected more than 48,000 of Musk's posts over the past 4 years, with support from the International Centre for Journalists Disarming Disinformation Programme and the research group Convocation Research and Design. The analysis focused on Twitter posts on the topic of election administration, security and operation. An analysis of nearly 17,000 of Musk's posts from this year, as well as thousands more he replied to or reposted, found 361 posts specifically on the topic of potential election fraud in the US elections. Although these election posts represent a small fraction of the dozens of posts Musk publishes each day, each one had an average of 9.3 million views, as Musk continues to be the most followed profile on Twitter. Experts are concerned that such a high audience engagement on posts amplifying election fraud conspiracies could set a stage for possible post-election chaos. And then when you go and look at the stats down here, and he's of course put $75 million into the America Super PAC. The skepticism, here we go. Let me just find it actually, because I read that the first thing this morning. It was actually the paragraph before I needed to read. So CBS News confirmed, which is their fact check team, the confirmed team fact-checked Musk's post on election security and found that 55% contain misleading or false statements, or amplified posts that do. Further analysis of these posts showed that 40 of the accounts Musk replied to or reposted were accounts researchers have identified as promoters of voter fraud claims. And, you know, so Musk has used a social media platform he owns to amass nearly 3.3 billion views on Twitter by fueling doubts about election security issues since January this year, making the tech mogul one of the most viral voices on elections during the 2024 campaign. And then down at the end here, and of course, why I'm saying this isn't about the US election, although, you know, it's relevant and it's relevant for Ukraine. But he's doing the same sort of things with regard to Ukraine and Russia. So this isn't only, this team has looked at specifically election fraud claims, but actually, you know, you can extrapolate this right across the suite of things he talks about. Here, a quote from someone concerning this. These kinds of lies make the assumption that the real voters are white voters. So he's talking about great replacement theory and importing voters, said Gilda Daniels, author and professor of University of Baltimore Law School. The otherism and the idea that immigration is out of control and we have all these people who are not white voting. Non-citizen voting is not widespread, and it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in national elections. Non-citizens who vote can face fines, prison time, and even deportation. A Washington Post analysis of the Conservative Heritage Foundation's data found that of 2 billion votes cast since 1979, there are only 85 cases involving allegations of non-citizen voting. The other post that Musk frequently engages with discuss potential tampering with voting machines. And then his posts on mail-in ballots have a combined 344 million views, voter ID 524 million views. The point is that he has huge reach, and this is doing damage. And they are just 55% of what he says is disinformation or misinformation. Extremely concerning, Musk wrote in a post that gained 65.7 million views, talking about some other issue. And of course, another thing that Musk does is questions whether can this be true, and he invites people to do community notes to eventually say, oh, it's not true. But the fact is that until community notes does post that, it does the damage it needs to do. So you say, oh, this might be massive disinformation, or it could be true. What do you guys think? And already you're putting that information out there. And then if someone then community notes your post, they're not community noting all the other people who have spread that disinformation. So the community notes, it looks like you're inviting someone to fact check what you say. Then it gets fact checked. But everyone else who spread it isn't getting fact checking in the same way, and there aren't the community notes on all of them. In other words, this is just a kind of I'm just asking questions way of spreading disinformation, and it's what he does all the time. He's really disingenuous, and this doesn't help Ukraine, it doesn't help democracy, etc., etc. So talking about further disinformation, we've got Tara Reade, who made the allegations of sexual abuse against Joe Biden all that time ago, and everyone's like, oh my goodness, Joe Biden, this is terrible. It turns out she was an absolutely incredible, and I mean that in a technical sense, as in you couldn't believe her. She was not credulous, as a incredulous witness, if you like, or claimant or whatever. And there are all these theories about, this is just Russian disinformation. And to almost prove that it was Russian disinformation, she made these allegations. They all fell apart. And then she went to Russia and she became a dissident in Russia. You're like, oh, right. So really, it did come from Russia. So now she lives in Russia, slagging off the US. She's basically Steven Seagal in female form. Tara Reade claimed that Biden and Harris are plotting World War III, quote, America keeps poking the bear, and Vladimir Putin is wise and patient. Anyone still awake at this point would have heard her once again plead for Russian citizenship from Vladimir Vladimirovich. There you go. Once a grifter, always a grifter. So she's like poking her head up again and saying all this stuff. Right. You heard about Tim Pool, who's one of these YouTubers who's taking money through Tenet Media. Tenet Media were found in an indictment to have received $10 million from Russia and knowingly put out to these YouTubers to spread Russian disinformation. Now, the question is, did these YouTubers know that information was false? There's lots of argument going on about that, but the people at Tenet Media did know that. They did know the money was coming from Russia, etc., etc. So the people like what's her name, Chen from Canada, who's this right-wing influencer who was part of the Tenet Media, her and her husband, and they were feeding this money. Now this money has been cut off to people like Tim Pool. So Tim Pool runs this right-wing YouTube channel. It's hilarious for me because I despise this man, absolutely despise him. He's done this whole video whinging about how his business is going to go out of business. He's got people that work for him that aren't really pulling their weight, and he's working 16 hours a day, and etc., etc. And video is music to my ears, right? So Pekka Kalinemi here says, as soon as his Russian money source dries up, Tim Pool decides to end his show. What a coincidence indeed. And there are lots of people talking about this at the moment, talking about how that money has dried up and now he's going to go out of business. In other words, he really was relying on this money. Dean Blundell, a Canadian interested in disinformation, says, after being named by the DOJ as a paid Russian propagandist, a very nervous Tim Pool announced his show was over because he's rich, can't find enough people to operate a camera, and wants to spend more time with his family, blah, blah, blah. So as a podcaster and podcast network owner, he's full of Russian-made shite. It costs about $150 a month for software and tools to podcast. Can't find people to record, edit, and collect research. There are dozens of AI tools, PodSqueeze, Descript, Restream. One person can produce a professional podcast in less than 2 hours. He's got like 30 people working for him or something like that. Tim says it's impossible to do a show without 2 studios. It's fascinating, as 90% of people podcast at home. Yeah. And in fact, even my door's open. You heard my kids a second ago, so there you go. And so it goes on. whinging about everything, and the essential reality is he hasn't got money because the Russians aren't paying him. He hasn't got the money he had, which was huge amounts. He was getting, what was it, per month? Was it 400,000 or something insanely high? Tim also said it's time to spend more time with his family. He doesn't have one outside the Russian family, of course. So on and so forth. So lots of people talking about this. And then this tweet comes out, forget the last post, special Timcast in real life tonight, IRL, and it may be the last. So he's like thinking about jacking it in. I tell you what, I would be happy with that. Darth Putin says, nothing says I had no idea the money was from Russia, like cancelling your pro-Trump politics show 2 weeks before the election. He came out, Tim Pool, and put like a Ukrainian flag after the indictment on his handle and came out with this big apology. But, was it real? Did he really mean that? I don't know. Anyway, good riddance is all I can say. Right. Kim Jong-un's sister has come out and said Ukraine is an ill-mannered dog raised by the USA. Seoul and Kyiv fuss, beg and dare to carry irreversible nonsense about the nuclear weapon states. They are the same as 2 drops of water, she added. I think we're going to see a really interesting situation, like I said earlier, where people in the US, people in Europe are going to have to understand that if they support Russia, they are supporting North Korea. And North Korea is happy to slag off the USA. And, what are you going to do about that, USA? As in, I'm talking about people who are on the Russian appeasement side there. And talking about Kim Jong-un, of course, Trump has given him loads of props recently. And this is really freaking important. So this is one of the most important things I think I'm going to talk about. Speaking in Greensboro, North Carolina, former President Donald Trump tells supporters Xi Jinping is, quote, brilliant, Vladimir Putin is, quote, tough, and Kim Jong-un thinks Obama was a real jerk, and I think he's a real jerk. So Jim Sciutto's right here. So what Trump is doing all the time, and I've said this the last few days, and I've asked you, and someone said, oh, he does say nice things about democratically elected leaders. And I said, okay, prove it to me. You write down all the nice things he said about democratically elected leaders of the free world, and you write down all the nice things he said about dictators. You put them side by side and tell me how often he says nice things about dictators versus how often he says nice things about democratically elected leaders. This guy loves a freaking dictator. This guy loves a strongman because he wants to be one. This guy waxed lyrical on a hot mic to Ducey from Fox and Friends. Hot mic incident where he says, Kim Jong-un, they all sit up straight when he speaks. I want my people to do that. In other words, I want to be like Kim Jong-un. Why don't the American people treat me like a dictator? So Jim Sciutto says from CNN, says this is not isolated, it's a norm. Trump consistently praises the leaders of the US's biggest strategic adversaries while denigrating leaders of his own country. From the return of great powers to Donald Trump, Hungarian strongman Viktor Orbán is fantastic. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is brilliant. North Korea's Kim Jong-un is an okay guy. And most alarmingly, he allegedly said Adolf Hitler, quote, did some good things. A worldview that would reverse decades-old US foreign policy in a second term should he win November's presidential election, former senior advisors told CNN. So you've got this now, John Kelly, that's his former chief of staff. So this is a guy that, remember, Mike Pence has refused to endorse him. He's his vice president, for God's sake. And you've got John Kelly, who was his chief of staff, the guy that did everything for Trump. It was what John Spencer did in The West Wing, right? For President Bartlet, right? Okay, he's the guy that does everything. He's your go-to guy. Is like, I want this to happen. They go and make it happen. He's now spoken out, John Kelly, and said exactly what for.
He commented more than once that, that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good.
So what would you say when he said to you that Hitler did a lot of good things?
Well, I tell him that. I said, sir, first of all, you should never say that. But if you knew what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist life, philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It was certainly not done for the right reason. And but he would occasionally say that.
What would he say when you would lay that out to him?
You just, that'd be the end of the conversation usually.
So at the end of the conversation, you point out that Hitler's not such a good guy. He just finishes the conversation. So, like, you've got General Mark Milley, his Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying that he was fascist. You've got Vice President Mike Pence saying he's unstable. You've got all the people, you've got General Mattis, people saying he's unstable, should not be running the country. Why is it that 46% of people, maybe more, are going to vote for him? Why are some of you still in awe of this guy and wanting to vote for him, where you've got people around him saying, yeah, he said how wonderful Hitler was, that Hitler did some good things, and that, and people around him saying, yeah, he's a fascist and he's completely unstable. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't read books, right? The guy doesn't read, doesn't increase his knowledge. He's not a knowledgeable person. You look at his understanding of economics, macroeconomics. He can supposedly do some fairly good business deals, but that's a myth, as I pointed out in another video. Like, he's not a knowledgeable guy, and he's a dictator wannabe. And so he wins the election, Ukraine are in trouble, and dictators around the world are rejoicing. It's that simple. US presidential candidate Donald Trump revealed to the Wall Street Journal that he threatened Russian President Vladimir Putin to blow up Moscow if he invaded Ukraine. Trump once again reiterated that he had excellent relations with the Kremlin ruler. This comes after he recently blamed Zelensky and Joe Biden for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, saying Zelensky, quote, should never have let that war start. He blames Zelensky for the whole war and doesn't blame Putin. I don't know how you can not blame Putin. Why have we not heard him take Putin to task over being a murderous dictator? We've heard this from Kamala Harris. We've heard this from Joe Biden. We've not heard this from Trump, because he frickin' loves dictators. And he says nice things about Putin. He said more nice things about Putin than horrible things. When have you heard me say nice things about Putin? When have you said nice things about Putin? Why does he get to say nice things about Putin and you give him a free pass? Why do you, if you're a Trump supporter, give Trump a free pass over Putin, but you don't give yourself a free pass? Because you allow him that, because you love him for other things, and you can't handle that he would be terrible for Ukraine. There have been a couple of my viewers who said, actually, I do recognise he will be bad for Ukraine, but I'm going to vote for him on the basis of immigration or whatever. I give you more respect. Like, that is being honest by looking at the data and say, yeah, he ain't going to be good for Ukraine. But if you don't say that, I don't know. I think you've lost the plot. US Ambassador to NATO Julianne Smith has stated that the US is not yet prepared to invite Ukraine to join NATO. This is a real problem, which remains a key objective in Zelensky's victory plan. It's point number one. So there is that to worry about. Anyway, it's been a massively long video. Sorry about that. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.